for that kind invitation and from the organizers, of course, because I think this is my first visit to this place, and I really see the enthusiasm in the interactions that have been taken or taking on so up till this point. This type of a meeting is also a wonderful opportunity to catch up with old friends. And the ovarian cancer community being such a small one is always eager to know what the others have done. Not just because there's no sense of any competition, because the area is so vast, the amount of challenges are so many, but it's more of an eagerness to know how what the others are doing may perhaps complement what you yourself are trying to address, or perhaps we can do some joint development. So there's always a lot of eagerness in these kind of focused and short meetings, and I think they are more meaningful in a sense, especially for ovarian cancer. So without much ado, I think I'll begin with my talk. I stand between you and lunch, so I'm sure you would want to go. But I think Ramri in the morning mentioned that until I started my group at NCCS in 2001 January, and at that point of time there wasn't a single group working in on the fundamental research in ovarian cancer. Now, NCCS being a primary repository, which is a collection of cell lines that we not only collect but we also distribute all over India, I found that there were only two cell lines in the cell line repository. One was OVCAR3, which is widely used, and one was SKOV3, which was highly being doubted as being a HGSC cell line. So I thought that anyway there seems to be a need to work in this particular area. So I could start off by even establishing cell lines. And that could be one of the way to enhance or recruit other interests of other groups to start working on this. Because elsewhere in the world, especially in US and Australia at that time, there were large groups consortia being developed in ovarian cancer, and there was no talk of ovarian cancer, basic research at least. So with that in mind, I started looking at, I had a very enthusiastic set of clinical collaborators, Dr. Kopikar, Dr. Shona Nag, Dr. Gupte. There were at least 5 or 6 people who said, yes, we do need something to be done in this. We have no solutions. You remember this was just 2001 when PARP inhibitors were just being talked of, but not really, they were not there at all. But there were a lot of other opportunities that people were talking of, which seemed to have fizzled out down the line also. So I started receiving samples, and it was really a learning curve. My collaborators would make me stand in operations also, so that I really learned what the clinical disease was about. And I really appreciate that kind of a learning, which very few basic researchers get. So we started off processing a lot of samples. We had all kinds of samples which seemed to be aggressive, but surprisingly, when you look at the clinical characteristics, they seem to be aggressive. But when we tried to bring them into culture, they just were so docile and they couldn't move beyond a few passages. So that was quite frustrating at times. I still remember the first really aggressive sample I had was OT5. So it was obviously the fifth sample of HGSC that I received. And I still remember the physical appearance of those cells under the microscope. They were beautiful, shining, round, very healthy looking cells. Healthy in the context of a tumor, And they were really proliferating. They were growing so fast that, it was amazing. And then it was actually it was worrisome, because if you think about those type of cells growing inside the body of a woman, and then the disastrous outcomes were to be seen. So that is when we thought that we should start looking at it. Now, surprisingly, even alongside those healthy looking cells, we had different types of epithelia that were present along with those cells. Those cells just appeared different. although it came from the same sample. So then we started thinking, are there different types of epithelia present in tumors, or and especially because of the appearance of those cells, could they be cancer stem cells? Now that was a point of time when really there was no mention of cancer stem cells from solid tumors, although almost 6 to 7 years previous to that, leukemic stem cells had been identified by Professor John Dick, and there was a very wonderful review that Irving Weissman had written. So we started thinking, okay, are these very few? I mentioned to forget. I forgot to mention that these were very few in number, but those were the ones that slowly took up over the culture, tried to dominate the culture, and then give rise to these different looking epithelia. So that seemed to me like a classical stem cell hierarchy, wherein there was a phenotypic change. There seemed to be a dominance of one type of a cell, and then it was later that the differentiation, probably we were just hypothesizing at that time, that differentiation set in, and there was an epithelial kind of a culture that developed. So unfortunately, even this culture did not survive beyond 4 to 5 passages. But then that gave us an idea that if they were okay, at the same time, we were also working with normal ovarian surface epithelia, because you remember that until 2006 or 8, it was thought that ovarian cancer emerges from the ovarian surface epithelium. So we were bringing in we were establishing primary samples of ovarian surface epithelia. We noticed the phenomenon of epithelial to mesenchymal transitions, wherein it was really difficult to maintain those cells in an epithelial state, so as to say they would become mesothelial, and what we often would end up with mesenchymal like cultures. So we started on the side looking at this phenomenon, and because of our hypothesis that it could be stem cell driven, we thought that okay, there are no surface markers known for the normal stem cells in the ovary. Now, the earlier work which I mentioned in leukemia had been done with markers that are known for hematopoietic stem cells, and the same compositions were used, the same set of surface markers were used for isolating leukemic stem cells. We didn't have that advantage. So, the only thing that came to my mind was that stem cells are supposed to have a high capacity of self-renewal, so that if we really made single cell clones, then it should be only the stem cells that would proliferate or would be capable of multiplying and establishing clones. So that was when my technician and I started doing single cell cloning. We did extensive single cell cloning for innumerous number of samples, and we had leads with some samples that would go up to say passage 10 or so. Before, they were naturally limited probably by the media compositions that we were also trying to fine tune at that time. But it was in 2003 that we actually struck gold, and we had a particularly aggressive sample from a stage 3C HCAC individual, and our single cell cloning really worked out. Now, this was also coincidentally around the same time that stem cells were associated with other solid tumors, notably the neural tumors and breast cancer. So that was actually encouraging that we were at least trying to do something that would be received well later on. And then these single cell clones, we did around 126 single cell clones, out of which we were lucky that we had 19 clones that was just spontaneously immortalized. And it must have been a combination of the media as well as the intrinsic capabilities of those cells that led to this immortalization. But I have to say, luck had also a major role to play in establishing cell lines. And let me just tell you, I had not planned to talk of this, but when Ramre mentioned it, I said, okay, since there are students in the audience, I think, if one has to pick up a really challenging area of work, it's things like establishment of cell line, which otherwise seems so simple. It took us almost 2 years before we could even establish one single cell line. And then we had 19 of them actually. not just one cell line that we had. We then went on to characterize this. This is a very old story. This was published way back in 2005. But I thought I would mention it just because of the type of focus that you have to have and how you need to keep on changing your own thought processes in order to actually arrive at maybe whatever was your aim. So that is something, okay, since I had added it before, I forgot to remove this name. So today my lab works on several aspects of ovarian cancer biology. We focus on only HGSC. Cancer stem cells is something we started off with. Alongside that, we had been working with epithelial to mesenchymal transitions. And then, working in these two areas gave us a thought that the omics technologies were just emerging around that time, and we thought that we could get a deeper understanding of these processes or these type of cellular changes that occur in tumor if we applied omics, and which in fact trying to validate some of these omics predictions led us to tumor heterogeneity. Today, we are also looking at transcriptional diversity, which I mentioned briefly in the panel discussion, wherein we are looking at transcriptional chimerism and whether that will, in fact, we believe that they might actually emerge from large scale genomic insertions or deletions. There are a lot of changes that occur in the context of HRD. We have also heard of those. So we are still wondering whether these can be connected to those type of changes that are known to take place in a subset of tumors. Now, genetic heterogeneity was something that we immediately also noticed, because out of the 19 clones that we had established, only one was actually tumorigenic, which came as a big surprise to us. And then we had another clone that acquired a spontaneous transformation event probably, and that became tumorigenic. So we had some cell lines that were actually paired. In fact, 4 of those, plus the original tumor initiating clone as we called it, that acquired this capability of transformation. But a majority of the others did not have any potential to give rise to tumors. We tested just some of them in mice. Our classical assays were enough to indicate that they did not have any tumorigenicity. So again, at that time there was nothing called as sequencing. These technologies were not available. So we resorted to something that would give us at least an indication. We just profiled the mitochondrial mutational profiles of these 19 clones. And we thought we were, at that point, I know that Professor Robert Weinberg was trying to establish a model, a progression model in a sense, wherein he would knock in a few oncogenes or knock out a few tumor suppressor genes in order to make progression models. Not in ovarian cancer, he was doing it in breast cancer. And I thought that, okay, probably we've stumbled upon some clones like that are poised differently in the trajectory towards transformation. And if we were to just identify a progressive, say, increase in the mutational load, we would be able to capture that progress. But to our actually surprise, we found that this gave us 2 groups of clones, one which had the basic germline profile and the other one which had the profile which included the 5 tumorigenic clones. But it was definitely certain that there is genetic heterogeneity. So our eyes, we were primed for looking at heterogeneity from that point onwards. Then again, we found that the heterogeneity reflected on the functional association with the germline clones, stem cell clones, actually having a capability to undergo vasculogenic differentiation. So it seemed that a spheroid actually piggybacks some normal stem cells on its progression or during its metastasis, and in some way, once it lands in a suitable secondary site, it may actually lead to vasculogenic development at that site. So that was the hypothesis we were working at, but and we should have probably followed up these leads, but we did not because we were doing too many things at that time. Now, as I said, we did a lot of omics to understand these aspects at a deeper level, and we came up with some signatures. We looked at what were some of the histone modifications was especially interesting because these bivalent histone modifications, where you have a activating as well as a repressive mark on the same promoter, keeps that gene poised at a state where it can easily be either repressed or activated. So those were very interesting observations that we were looking at. But once we arrived at some of these signatures, we wanted to actually validate the expression of these signatures in patient tumors, because finally, you can start off with a lot of data, but the proof of the pudding is when you actually can see some of these expressions in the tumors. And that is when we really landed up with a lot of frustration, because come what may, we could not universally assign the same type of a confirmation that we were receiving from our data analysis. So that in fact brought to our mind the entire concept of tumor cell heterogeneity, inter-tumor heterogeneity, as well as intra-tumor heterogeneity. So we had expression patterns. Even if we had expressions that were enriched within, say, a tumor, they would not be there in all the cells of the tumor. So if one has to actually, all this was towards drug development. So if you have to develop drugs, then you have to target the expression again to maximize at least the expression of that particular druggable target in order to get effective therapy. And again, for the I will not go into the intratumor heterogeneity today, but then we started looking at whether we could stratify some of these tumors based on their molecular patterns, which has been done in so many other tumor samples. Because high-grade serous ovarian cancer, although everyone talked about the heterogeneity, even at that point of time, until the TCGA came in, there was really no understanding. And I think I must mention that the TCGA was a great boon for ovarian cancer, because this was the second tumor type to be picked up. So we had access to those samples even before the TCGA itself had begun its analysis. And in fact, some of our omics data was published before the TCGA came up with its stratification paper in Nature. So since we had access to the TCGA data, we started a top-down as well as a bottom-up stratification analysis, but something called as weighted gene correlation network analysis worked, and we could stratify and identify 3 subgroups. The TCGA itself had identified 4 subgroups, and since we were using the same data sets, we tried to understand the overlaps or the differences between these. So what we had were 3 subgroups: class 1, class 2 and class 3 as we called it. Class 1 was an entirely epithelial type of tumor, suggested to be a subtype, epithelial subtype. Class 2 was a kind of a mesenchymal subtype, and class 3 actually, to our surprise, was something like a mixed type of a subtype, depending on these red and green represent different modules, and each of these modules is actually associated with a specific functionality. So the expression patterns did not just correlate with certain sets of genes, but their analysis further could give us an understanding of what are the possible functional or the functions associated with each subtype. So as you can see, the class 1 tumors had an epithelial identity, were HRD tumors, and they also showed some aberrant cell activation and differentiation pathways. Class 2 tumors were a boon to us because we had stumbled upon the classical EMT associated pathways, and which were really so easy for us to pick up. They undergo EMT, but what was very surprising is that they had a strong correlation with the tumor microenvironment. So the difference that we saw in these tumors when we started looking at it in patient tumors as well as in xenografts that we identified as being representative of these groups is that this class of tumor had a very poor stroma, whereas the stroma of this as well as the ECM component within these tumors was very high. In fact, the M3, this entire module, which is represented as the M3 module, actually had different types of ECM components that were enriched in it. Along with it were the EMT genes, and then M9 was the immune component. So these actually tumors overlap with the immune competent tumor subset which was there in the TCGA. Then again, we had the cell line models that we identified as being representative. We proved some of the factors, some of the features that we had identified in those networks, and so on and so forth. And then we actually ignored the class 3 tumors at that time point of time, because we just thought this was a mixed subclass, and we thought about it as a TNBC type of a equivalent of HGSC. So we just kind of ignored it because it was going to be too difficult to address. But I'll tell you how we've come back. I mean, life turns a circle over and over again. We focused only on the class 1 and class 2 tumors. We had a very, I had a very nice student who took up the challenge of validating this in clinical samples. We had an entire panel of histopathologists who cooperated with us in developing some of the guidelines for assessing these, some of the markers that we identified which were likely to correlate with these. So we came up with a panel of 6 markers, biomarkers, that we used it. We started stratification initially using the xenograph models of our representative cell lines, and then went on to do this to derive a scoring system for these in patient samples, and then we came up to this. The class 3 actually, using this panel of cell lines, segregated out as 2 kind of subsets again. One that were positive for a large majority of the 6 molecules that we were using as biomarkers, or those that were largely negative. So those were what we called as the double positive or the double negative type of tumors. So there are a lot of observations that we really learned from this, but the most interesting and something that we had not predicted was that of class switching. Since these were from almost 96 clinical cases, we had some cases wherein we had the primary tumor, the metastatic tumor, or tumors that were harvested or obtained before treatment and post-treatment and things like that. So when we started comparing the stratification in all these settings, we found that there was always a subset of tumors that seemed to change their classification, and this largely happened after chemotherapy. So it seems that chemotherapy perturbs some of the patterns, and there was always a reversion either from the double positive or the double negative towards an epithelial state, which we thought was rather interesting. Given that actually it was thought that EMT is actually a much more aggressive state than the epithelial state. But this was again just an observation. And then later a student, Sagar Varankar, who joined the lab, took this challenge up, and he's extensively studied the phenotypic plasticity. And there's a lot of interest at present in phenotypic plasticity, wherein cells EMT was thought earlier to be a biphasic state, wherein epithelial cells just transit and become mesenchymal to invade in the context of cancer biology. But now it is known to be it involves several intermediate steps, wherein you have a slow gradient of phenotypes that is generated right from epithelial to intermediate epithelial, EM hybrid as it is called, intermediate mesenchymal, and then a mesenchymal one. So Sagar has very meticulously looked at it, and I knew I wouldn't have the time, so I'm just mentioning it, but we have some publications in this area if anyone is interested in looking it up. At that time, Gaurav also joined the lab, and then he was very much interested in immunology, and he said, why can't we look at developing some monoclonal antibodies? I had a colleague, Dr. Parab, who was expert in monoclonal antibody development. So Gaurav and Dr. Parab actually worked together extensively, and we came up with at least 4 monoclonal antibodies, of which we found one was actually cytotoxic, and it recognizes a molecule called it as annexin A2, which is expressed in the class 2 tumors. So this is something that we went ahead and patented. We showed its efficacy using most of the xenografts, and we developed a PDX model which was of that category, so we could actually show that it might be of effect even in human disease. I mentioned a syngenic mouse model that we've been developing. That was actually also an extension of our immunotherapy interest in immunotherapy, and that is also working out very well. So this is where we again came back to the class 3 tumors. The ID8 cells, which were derived from the ovarian surface epithelium of a C57 mouse strain, actually had undergone a spontaneous transformation, and that is probably the most commonly used syngenic mouse model for ovarian cancer research. So when we mapped it up based on the stratification program plan we had, we found that it actually expressed both markers, the both sets of markers. It also showed some of the functionalities that could be attributed to both these groups. So we were really pleased because we seem to have at least a model of this. And Ritika currently is studying this model, and this is very interesting. As I said, it expresses markers of both the classes, so it's suggested to be a mixed or the class 3 type of model. When we generate subcutaneous tumors, it shifts, towards the M side. That is the class 2 model or the class 2 type of stratification. However, when we introduce those in an orthotopic setting, they recapitulate a classical epithelial type of a tumor on the surface of the ovary. Our orthotopic model actually just undergoes a natural progression and metastasis, wherein you have peritoneal ascites that is generated, as well as it metastasizes to all the peritoneal organs. So we have looked at some of the peritoneal organs. So this is representative of the intestine. So again, in the ascites, it becomes a mesenchymal or a class 2 type of a tumor, whereas in some of the metastatic organs, in the intestine, it becomes an epithelial type of a tumor, whereas in some of the in the spleen, it remains as a mixed type of a tumor. Now this itself is almost frightening to think about, So what do we had developed a monoclonal antibody which we thought was specific for class 2 tumors. Now this kind of a setting wherein you have different tumors that have different surface expression, entire pathways that are regulating their survival, even regeneration, because we were looking also at the stem cell regeneration pathways in these subtypes separately, actually present a challenge about what is the type of treatment that you can actually come up with. A monoclonal antibody would obviously fail in this setting. It is of no use. And then, because this was in a syngenic mouse model, we started characterizing all the different types of chimeric transcripts that are expressed in each one of these tumors. We are trying to identify one more thing is that we extensively characterize the tumor microenvironment in this, including the immune component. We have exact mapping of the of these components, and we know that what might possibly work out. We are also looking at the antigen presenting machinery in these cells. At least in these cells it is intact, although in patient tumors I know that it can be compromised, and that could be one of the reasons why even despite the presence of CD8 cells you may not get any protection. So these are some of the questions that we are actually asking, and this is something that is the syngenic mouse model characterization. Its preliminary characterization is currently under review. Now, do I have time? Or should I wrap up? There was just one thing that I wanted to emphasize on. Since we work with xenografts, there is one very surprising facet that we have actually been looking at, and that is genetic instability. We see extremely perturb chromosomal numbers in some of these. Now we have been looking at this since a very long time, but these being cell lines, we didn't really consider this as a major observation, except that we know that cells that are aneuploid to this extent are usually drug resistant. But in the course of our work recently, wherein we are looking at these chimeric transcripts, we stumbled upon a splice variant in ITGB8, that is integrin beta 8, and this is a variant that has not been reported earlier. It has just one additional exon of 47 base pairs that is inserted and one of 86 base pairs that is eliminated. So this is a completely new variant which was identified, and we have tried to express this. I mean, we do all the classical approaches wherein we try to express it. We found cell lines in which it is highly expressed. We also found that this is expressed in several tumors in the TCGA data. Roughly, I think 14.8% tumors in the TCGA data actually express this particular variant. So we started looking at it. Knocking it down sometimes did not really make a difference to the cell line. It just continued proliferating. Only the cell cycle was slightly lowered, but there was no really impact on survival. The real situation or the cellular context wherein it made some sense was in cell lines in which you had specific P53 mutations, wherein expression of those, I mean, there was very low baseline expression of this particular variant in these cell lines, and when we expressed it, we found an almost whole genome doubling. So and a lot of mitotic phases that were abnormal, we found that most of these cells had a very high number of enhanced H2AX expression, but also increased number of H2AX foci even per nucleus. So this actually made us go ahead and look at the karyotype, affirmed that these were not doublet cells that were being counted in flow cytometry, and then this is the type of karyotypes we came up with, and this is a distinct shift from a say 2N to a 4N karyotype. Ankita and Arvind in the lab have been looking at this extensively, and we have done RNA sequencing to address some of the functional pathways that seem to be involved in this. This has just been published recently, so if anyone is interested in it, you can have a look at it. But again, this also brings to mind some of the pathways that are actually perturbed in class 1 tumors now. We go back to the class 1 tumors, and whether, now what we are trying to see is, even in a syngeneic mouse model, whether there is increased HRD in the tumors that appear in the E state versus those that are there in the peritoneum, and whether some of these pathways are also triggered from the mixed type of a tumor that might be at the primary presentation. So I think the take-home message for us is that every time we try to address a single question, we are raising at least 4 or 5 more that for which we don't have any answers. So that is how our research has sustained over the years, and I hope there will be some more we will take on this ahead. As publicity now, you request that so I thank you all for a very patient hearing despite the hunger pangs that must have set in, but not before I acknowledge all the members in my group. And actually I have several artists in my group. I don't know what it is, but I've always had artists in my group, and I have these 2 girls, Ankita and Amrita, who make caricatures of each and every person who joins the group. So we have a changing kind of a portrait always in the group whenever anyone visits. So please visit, not just to talk about collaborations, but also to appreciate and encourage them. Thank you. Is there time for questions, or should we take it to lunch? Yes. Yes, Ramli.
Okay, sure. So, Sharmila, in the integrin beta 8 overexpression that you've done, have you looked at identify the cross of single cells to see if there's a specific chromosomal pattern that you are achieving, or is it plastic?
We've done that. Actually, I didn't spend time over that. So this is what we saw. These are the changes in the chromosomes. So we mapped out these chromosomes, and we've actually identified which are the ones that are. So surprisingly, chromosome 13 never would double. In fact, it would go down to even a single. Just it would half sometime. There was no doubling. There was halving. So I don't know what it is. There is some information there probably. So even this is something our cytogeneticist, she just gave up on us because there were a lot of marker chromosomes that were also generated. If you look at this, these are all the marker chromosomes that are generated, which are just fragments generated from something. And then we use a AI based approach to even stratify these, and then this is how we arrived at what was probably duplicated and what was not.
Okay.
But the number of marker chromosomes itself is pretty high.
Yeah, very.
Fantastic talk. We really enjoyed it. I have many questions, but just your class 1, 2, 3 classification. Did you get a chance to look at this signature in public data set or something, and were they predictive of the same consequence? Did you look at anything like that?
Yes. Since
Was
we
there,
had predicted these classes starting from the
You
TCGA
did a
data set,
top-down approach.
what we did, we had used the TCGA data, but then we went back and looked at other omics data also,
Okay.
data sets also. So we did find that these were expressed, but we didn't get a very good correlation, our differences in the survival.
Okay.
And I think as
But
we
was
have
there a specific metastatic pattern or anything like that?
Yes, definitely. In fact, when Sagar started his work using cell line models also, what we found is that the mechanism of migration is actually different in both of these classes. We had something called as cooperative cell migration or passive, which is a very passive way of working. So we think that the class 1 tumors probably just passively shed, and that is known in the clinic. They just shed and they are localized to the peritoneal organs. Whereas those that are capable of EMT, in addition to being there in the peritoneum, they are the ones that are likely to be invasive. So this is something we did try to look at in our mouse models, but we don't have the clinical correlates of that.
I think that it would be interesting to see in a long-term,
Yes.
longitudinally followed up cohort to
Yes.
see if we can replicate this.
Yes. So Dr. Sudeep Gupta and Dr. Amita Maheshwari at TMH were actually quite eager to
Okay.
look at these. In fact, they were predicting that probably your class 1 tumors are likely to be the ones which present with a lesser amount of ascites as well.
Yeah, so that's what I think we can discern from that kind, but the validation would be interesting.
Yes.